Hi, everyone. I believe we are live and ready to go. I thought I would talk to you a little bit today about tone concept and developing your tone concept, which is, I realized in the age of electronic teaching is a little bit of a challenge. For those of us who have been teaching over Zoom or been listening to others teach over Zoom or playing, there's not a whole lot of nuance involved. So I actually have some sound files queued up that I plan to share with you, and a lot of other discussions. So I thought I'd first kind of give you an overview, I think, of some of the issues with discussing tone concept. It's a little bit of a complex issue, and there are a few reasons for this. I guess the first one, and this is kind of, I think what you could consider, or what I consider, a fundamental tenet of tone concept, which is your tone concept informs everything you do, unless everything you do affects your tone. Now, let me tease that out just a little bit. What I mean by that is, if you have a fundamental tone concept that you're expecting, that you have expectations for, that informs your articulation, your technique even, like making sure when your technique is even and very clear. We have, it's very resonant, right? Vibrato, for sure. And so really, like, the tone concept informs everything. But if we don't have a clear understanding of that, your articulation, your vibrato, all actually maybe gets in the way, so to speak. So it's also really difficult to discuss, I think, because so much of how we talk about it is in analogy or metaphor. So if you think about it, really, we hear it and we say it all the time. It's such a part of the vernacular that we don't even really give it any thought. The sound is high or low, or it's bright or dark. I asked two of my friends that are orchestral players to give me kind of descriptions of their ideal sounds. And one of them gave me actually his teacher's description of an ideal sound, Robert Marcellus, who's a very, very famous clarinetist and teacher, actually taught at Northwestern. And he said he used to describe it like a pear, like the ideal clarinet sound is like a pear, meaning that the pear is smaller at the top and bigger at the bottom. So think of not too many highs, but lots of nice lows. Another one said their ideal sound would be rich and colorful without being forced and direct. Now, both of those descriptions make a ton of sense to me, meaning I know exactly what they mean and I can imagine that sound. But it's also because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and wrestling with my own tone concept and kind of wrapping my mind around those ideas. But, it's also keep in mind, not only are we discussing them in terms of metaphor, we also like make assumptions about comprehension. So if you're inexperienced in describing sound, like, you realize how difficult it is to put into words like these inherently non-semantic sensations. Or you can easily, misinterpret some descriptors. In some ways, it's like discussing a color. For instance, like, you can't be sure that what I see as blue is what you see as blue, or that we experience them the same ways. So the same thing is true in terms of sound. We're really discussing this, in terms of a spectrum or a palette. Like, one person's bright isn't necessarily the next person's, and one instrument's bright or dark isn't the same as another instrument's. So I think it's important that we understand that there is the spectrum or sliding scale of these words and these understandings. And then we have to know how to take these ideas and information and put them into action. And really, this so much of what we at first talk about in terms of describing the sound or describing tone sept is conceptual or theoretical. But this information guides and should guide a pragmatic approach through intention and expectation. And so that's kind of the overview I wanted to give in terms of kind of where we're at with this and kind of our points of attack. And so then I think we're going to just go through and talk about, you know, some of these concepts, how to discuss them. And then I'm going to give you some exercises really that I think can synthesize these ideas and put it all together. So I guess the first question is like, is defining a tone concept or a sound concept, and what is it? And so I think I wrestled with this, and I wrote something down, and I'd like to give it to you here. So this could likely be best described as an ideal or set of musical ideals you represent or achieve or seek to achieve through your instrument. So personally, I don't view this as a concrete thing, almost a complex character capable of variance, so that your approach changes depending on the style of repertoire you're playing. You know, I think it's important that you have all of this flexibility in your approach, so that you can meet the piece that you're playing, the repertoire that you're playing, on its own terms. You know, you certainly don't want to use the same kind of vibrato that would use at the opening of the Doll Concerto for the Debussy Rhapsody. But understanding why, you know, making choices about that and making informed decisions about how you're coming to that. So that's my idea of a sound concept. It's not a concrete thing. You can still sound like you while changing your approach to match that repertoire. So I guess the first step, I think that's really important for us also, is then describing different components of the sound. And the only way to do this, I think, is through really careful analytical listening. And I think it's really, really important to listen to music overall, not just saxophone music, not just the piece that you're studying. Of course, that's valuable, but you need to be a student of music, not a saxophonist. And so understanding the differences, you know, in sound quality from one violinist to the next, or within different schools of instrumental playing. For instance, I think, you know, you need to listen to voice a lot, flutes, oboes, violin, cello. I think you can learn so much by those approaches. And in fact, one of the things that I want to do with you now, there are kind of two distinct, or not more than two distinct, several distinct schools of oboe playing, for instance. You know, German or French or American. And I think in order to really get to this analytical listening, it's important to compare not just different players, but actually, if you can, different players on the same piece, different players from different schools on the same piece. So I have actually queued up for you some recordings of the Mozart oboe concerto, and I have selected 3 different players on the Mozart that I want you to listen to. And we're only going to listen to about 30 seconds for each clip. But ask yourself, like, how would I describe their tone? Do I like it? Is it pure? You know, I think dark and bright tend to be loaded words, personally. I don't view either one of them as the ideal or the or a negative. I mean, to me, bright is projection and more presence of overtones, and dark can be beautiful too. But oftentimes, bright, I think, gets a negative connotation. So I think if you can explore other ways of describing it, I think that's really good. But, you know, do I like the vibrato? Is it flexible? You know, expressive? How fast is it? You know, articulation is a huge thing. If you're listening to vocalists, diction is a huge thing. And so, you know, just really throw everything on the table and listen to this, and just let's, you know, we're not going to actually obviously have a comparison within this, but I'm just going to give you 3 different people playing the same section of the Mozart oboe concerto, so you can just kind of listen for the different styles. Now, if you aren't listening on really good speakers, if you're listening on laptop speakers, that can also affect it. Ideally, we have a great sound system at home, but if not, at least a good set of headphones can go a long way. So I'm going to play for you. The 3 artists I've selected on this, I think, are amazing players, amazing musicians. And so the first is Albrecht Meyer. He's the principal oboist in the Berlin Phil, obviously from the German tradition. Okay, so there's our first example. The second is a French oboist, Francois Leloup, also an amazing musician. And this is the same section. Okay, and the third is a Russian-born oboist, but plays in the San Francisco Symphony now, is really kind of indicative of what's considered to be the American tradition of playing now. Okay, so 3, you know, in my opinion, very different players that are making, all making beautiful decisions, but very differently. They center their vibrato in a different place in their sound. Their articulations are different. Just their overall sustain, their sound itself. If you were to remove the vibrato or articulations, you know, it's a very different sound for the 3 of them. And so I think the more you can pick those things out and decide what it is that you like about their sound, what it is that you don't like about their sound. Most of my students, when we've worked on this, they'll tell you it's just as important to know what you don't like about somebody's sound as it is what you like. Because sometimes you don't quite know what you like, but at least you could say, yeah, I don't like that, or that doesn't work for me. I don't want that as part of my sound. I just thought I would also share with you an oboist who I think is a fantastic example of the American school. By the way, I'm not sure if I gave you the 3rd oboist's name. It's Eugene Isatoff. He's the principal oboist in San Francisco Symphony. But you know, an oboist that was a principal oboe in St. Louis Symphony forever, Peter Bowman, and just a phenomenal musician. I don't have a recording of him playing the Mozart, but I thought I would just share with you a small recording. And by the way, I will be posting links to all of these recordings on the page afterwards, just so you'll have it, okay? But this is Peter Bowman, also in the American School, and I think when you listen to Isotov by comparison to Bowman, you hear a lot of differences within that as well. So this is Peter Bowman. So, you know, it plays with, I think, almost an ideal vibrato in that setting. Just a gorgeous tone, very centered, but such beautiful legato and expressive while also being incredibly controlled. I think he's just a real model of a lot of those things. So, you know, I think, you know, one of the other things that I'm going to send you is a list of, it must be 400 adjectives that I got from a class that I took at Northwestern called Pattern and Meaning in Music. And this was a fantastic class for me because it really synthesized a lot of the combination between music theory and music interpretation. And I think starting to understand, you know, and starting to connect, you know, different descriptions to sound is a really important thing, because sound is non-semantic. It's frequencies vibrating at certain pitches or certain speeds, and you know, in order to really put this into words requires a lot of listening and a lot of study. And so I'm going to send you this because it automatically, just as a reference, has all of these words that you can choose and start to think about. And so the more you listen, the more you study. I think it's really important that you're always seeking out great artists. That's the most important thing, is as you're cultivating your ears and cultivating your sense of tone concept and what you want yours to be, you always have to be modeling first and finding these great artists. If you don't know who they are, talk to your colleagues. If you're a student, talk to your teachers. I mean, I've had so many wonderful conversations with my colleagues at, you know, either at my university here or at, you know, all across in music, you know, just talking about, like, who do you listen to? Who do you love? Who's playing? Are you passionate about? Who do you always go back to and listen to and still get things from? I think that's one of the most important things you can do. And so, like I said, start to incorporate it. Start to explore. You know, if I think this sound is an ideal for me, how do I get there? And so this is our next step, is really finding, you know, taking these concepts, taking this these musical ideas and putting, you know, this intention and putting some pragmatic steps behind it. So, you know, the concept, or it has to filter down through, you know, the intention and concept has to filter down into the pragmatism, into the nuts and bolts of everyday, you know, fundamental practice. So here, you know, just some strictly saxophone things. First, just talking about the sustain, the sound in the sustain. There are really three super important components to this, and that is airspeed or support or pressure, tongue position or voicing, and embouchure support. And what's so important about this is that they all need to work in balance to create an ideal sound. One of the main issues I hear from a lot of students is the tendency to use too much embouchure pressure, or really to, I guess another way to put it would be to substitute embouchure pressure for air support. And that, Professor Rickmeyer talked about this yesterday. It exacerbates, differences in range, because when you're tuning with the octave key down on an F sharp, when the octave key is opened, the instrument is automatically more reactive to pressure in the, from the jaw. And so you won't push in far enough for the middle register to be in tune. But if you're playing a high B or a high C sharp, the tendency is for that to immediately be too high because of that. So I like to discuss, the concept of tall embouchure. This is, it comes from the clarinet teaching, but the idea of, we have, firm lower lip cushion, firm upper lip kind of point. The upper lip should be engaged into the top of the mouthpiece, but the lower lip should be kind of hugging the teeth, or almost kind of, against the teeth, not into the reed, not up into the reed. And so the idea of the tall embouchure then is not engaging any extra pressure onto the reed itself. I think it's also important to visualize or to conceptualize like the space between your molars. One of the things I use, if you were to take blueberries and just hold them between your molars without crushing them, you want that openness back there. We don't want everything to be coming down onto the reed and mouthpiece. So there's that. Then tongue position, okay. Tongue position is one that's really difficult to discuss for a lot of folks, because you rely so much on perception. And when we're speaking about this, it's really important that we try to be as specific as possible. So one of the things that I like to do with my students is go back and forth between an E sound. So if you were just to vocalize E, to understand what the tongue is doing when you're saying that. When I say E, it's a higher tongue. It's a broader tongue. The sides of the tongue are at the sides of my top molars, and so that's higher. And then to understand the difference between that and O, and so those are very different. They're, when we're just speaking, we don't think about, well, my tongue's higher or lower or forward or back. We just speak. But when we're playing and we're trying to find the right, as Professor Rickmeyer said yesterday, the ideal oral cavity, this takes a lot of connection between the perception and the reality. So for me to go from E to U, I think if you slide from E to U, so EU, what happens is we're bringing the front of the tongue down a little bit, and that gives us almost kind of the French EU sound, and that gets us pretty close to, for me, for my concept, to an ideal kind of home-based tongue position. And so from there, I think there are a lot of exercises we can do to make sure that we're supporting. One of the first ones that I do is mouthpiece. And again, as Professor Rickmeyer was saying yesterday, doing mouthpiece exercises, I think that if you can, at forte, as Rousseau, I believe it was maybe way back in 1962 that he first published an article on mouthpiece busking, but getting an A or a B flat on the alto mouthpiece at forte, I think is, you can get pretty close to being, your correct approach. But I think from there, doing mouthpiece pitch exercises. So bending the pitch down to G sharp, back up to A, down to G, back up to A, and understanding that we're doing that only with oral cavity shaping. We're not changing the jaw. We're not changing the musculature here. It's you know, internal. So A to G sharp, A to G, and then A to B flat, and then back down to A. And so understanding, you know, you should be able to get about an octave range on the mouthpiece. So you should be able to get up to a C, above the A that we would naturally buzz, and down to the C below that. If you can do that, then you've got a really good sense of flexibility and how the variance in tongue position or voicing, and subsequently airspeed or pressure affects mouthpiece pitch. And then according to that, you then also have a lot of control over your fundamental sound and the balance of overtones in that sound. From there, you can go on to the Senta front F trick. That is a super helpful one. As several people have already said, I mean, I think if you can do the front F trick, then you've unlocked a lot of things about, you know, control that you have in the oral cavity. And especially as you get up into the altissimo, developing that connection and understanding what it takes to do that, you will certainly have, you know, a better idea of how to approach the different altissimo ranges. That's outside of what we're going to talk about today, but that's at least, you know, I want to acknowledge that. And then I think it's important to define legato. So, you know, for me, legato, you know, of course you want connection between the notes, but even if your notes are connected, even if everything is, you know, there's no space between anything, everything responds right in time. If you don't have a matched homogeneous sound across the range of the instrument, your listener doesn't perceive that as legato. At least I don't. You know, when you hear somebody, you know, for instance, just going across the break, and the mid register has one sound, and then as soon as you go to the fourth line D, the long tube notes has a totally different sound. You know, even if it's connected, you know, in terms of one note abuts to the next, it's not connected in terms of sound. And so this actually, I mean, there are like, you can get really off into the weeds with this, but there are some deeply, this is like deeply embedded in cognitive psychology, you know, like there are, from the Gestalt psychology laws of perceptual organization, you know, we hear things as similar or dissimilar, and or, you know, proximal or continuous, or all of these other laws, and if the sound isn't similar, we don't hear that as the same thing. So it's not a true legato. So we want to work on tone matching exercises. So like in the Marcel Moyes, the flute book on sonority, he gives a lot of exercises, just stepwise motion, matching one note to the next. For us, you need to make sure, you know, remember we have two activating octave mechanisms, one that goes from D to G sharp, and the other one that works from A and above. And oftentimes that's a range that people don't take into account enough, like the differences between the two octave keys. When you really listen back, there are substantial differences. And so we need to accommodate for that. We need to make sure that flexibility we're building with those mouthpiece exercises and overtone exercises, that we are using that flexibility in order to mask and create that more homogeneous sound. So, you know, in addition to the Moyes, I think just Remington exercises across the break, making sure that, you know, you can play a D and then play a C sharp right next to it and match that sound. And then also in the Rousseau saxophone high tones book, I think that I think it's on page 26. The exercise that's all front keys. If you can play your front keys, front E, you know, through A flat, really in tune and with a beautiful sound, you have figured out a lot about how to adjust. I hear a lot of times from my students that their front keys, you know, aren't any good, and the truth is we just haven't found the right approach to that yet. So that's based in flexibility as well. And then in addition to that, I think it's really important to explore, through long tones, I think what James Bunty and I call, and maybe I got this term from him, but niente fades. So working on start a note at mezzo forte and fade out all the way into silence. And then going from silence, bringing it all the way back up to mezzo forte, forte, whatever. Making sure you're keeping the same sound, the same tone quality, sorry, the same pitch. Don't allow pitch adjustment, pitch to creep up or to flatten depending on the dynamic you're playing. You learn so much about how to control the saxophone and to control your sound by playing between piano and silence. Saxophone's pretty easy to play forte on, but to really play a pure pianissimo to silence, that's difficult, and you learn how to control your air a different way, not just from the source, not just from the from your abdominal wall, but also just how you have to shape internally in the oral cavity to make that happen. So let's just talk a little bit about articulation now. I think that articulation is one that can be very, very distracting if people aren't doing it very well. So it's really important that the tongue position needs to match the note or the range that that's being played on a sustain for articulation. So what I mean by that is, the note, whatever note you're playing, wherever you would place that normally on a sustain, that also your articulation needs to match that. So we need to minimize movement, particularly movement in the middle and the back of the tongue. Obviously, we need to move in front of the tongue for articulation, but we need to minimize that movement so we can minimize pitch and tone quality change. Especially in the altissimo, I articulate on a very different part of my tongue in the altissimo than I do in the regular range, because we're doing very different things in order to get the altissimo to speak. And so if I try to use the same principles of articulation and placement that I would in the normal range, it's not going to work the same way. And the note either won't respond, or it'll be very out of tune, or pitch bends or whatever. So we need to make sure that however we would play that note in a sustain, so too do we play it that way when we're articulating. We need to make sure we're matching that oral cavity shape for the articulation as we do when we're sustaining. A good exercise for that is to play a note and keep your tongue, the tip of the tongue, as close to the reed as possible, without touching it, and sustain it there, and then start to lightly articulate and only come back to that position. So to make sure that we're minimizing movement, that we are consistently approaching it the same way, so that there isn't any inconsistency in that pitch and response. And so from there, once you can do that, then you can explore variants of air pressure and shape, balancing that to tongue weight. I also say this to my students a lot: not every word begins with T. And so, we need to explore, go way beyond, staccato or legato articulation, but really defining a whole spectrum, again, a spectrum of articulation to match the style of music that we're playing. And so this is just, all of these exercises, keep in mind, are going towards the same thing. It's having an ideal musical intention. And then I want to give a bit more time actually to vibrato. Vibrato, I think of the sound really in terms of dimensions, like at least two-dimensional, if not three-dimensional. I want, the sound to be round, of course, but when we have vibrato, there's an upper and a lower threshold to your sound anyway. But especially with vibrato, it's, vocalists, when you talk to them about vibrato, and I think that's the source that we have to go to, because that's that's what we're all imitating when we use vibrato is voice, and and so vocalists refer to a good vibrato as a kind of a tight spinning vibrato. Now, in our world, tight might sound like a negative, but what they mean is there's a range that vibrato moves within. And so also vocalist vibrato is alive. It changes based upon dynamics. It changes based upon just within one note, how they're shaping the note, the vibrato changes. And so in addition to it just being, a color, it's a super expressive tool that shows us direction, that shows us intent. And so I think we have to go there. Our vibrato, we want to make sure that I consider it, if you think of our sound, as a rectangle, let's say, the vibrato has to be within the sound, within the upper threshold and within the lower threshold. It's always clear to me when I hear people, like depending on where you center your vibrato in the sound, if it's too high, it sounds almost pressed, like the top of the wave gets flattened out. And when that happens, the vibrato has nowhere to go. So you get the sound. This happens a lot at forte. We tend to muscle up when we're playing louder, and because of that, our sound becomes less expressive in a way, because we don't have that expressive vibrato tool anymore. It just keeps hitting the top of the sound. If vibrato is too low, obviously we hear that as a big pitch change, number one. But also the bottom of the wave can be unfocused, and we hear a lot more air in the sound. Another issue with this can actually be the tongue can get involved in vibrato. Every now and then I'll hear somebody where their tongue is actually moving the vibrato too, and that gives a deeper wave than we want. So we want to keep that. But in addition to the upper and lower threshold in the sound, I think the one that hurts us the most expressively actually is the beginning of the note and the end of the note. So often I hear saxophonists playing and the vibrato happens just within the note. And this is a perfect example of this is the Larsen Concerto, second movement. It's this beautiful, simple melody, quarter notes. And you'll hear like, dee da, dee dum, dee da. And so about every 3 or 4 notes, we put some extra emphasis on it with vibrato. You would never, ever hear a vocalist do that. You would never, ever hear oboists do that. This is something that tends to be, I think, jaw related. And so a really, really good exercise for this, and one that feels uncomfortable to do, but just take 3 notes. Let's say a G on top of the staff, an F sharp, and an F natural right next to it, and just in half notes. Set the metronome slowly and force yourself to play vibrato either in eighth notes, triplets, whatever, and force yourself to keep the vibrato going across those 3 notes. The vibrato can't change for the note, and you realize almost immediately how much we tie vibrato to the note itself rather than to the overall phrase shape. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways we have to have from this is that, I want to play for you now, actually one of my favorite vocalists. I know I posted that Elizabeth Schwarzkopf recording before, but Mirella Freni, I think is kind of the pinnacle for me of just the Italian sopranos in the 20th century. I don't think anybody has surpassed her. And her vibrato is so perfect. It's so expressive. And the way vocalists approach intervals too, just as an aside, there's so much you can learn from it. And you'll hear it. I'm about to play a recording for you. Listen to how she uses her vibrato and listen to her phrase shapes. The vibrato keeps going through this. This isn't something that we can do. String players and vocalists have that really expressive slide that is not part of our, we don't have access to that. So, but I'm gonna play for you now, this recording, and this is gonna be a longer take. Part of it is just because I love it so much, but there's also so much to get out of this. So this is Mirella Freni. So that's, to me, that, you know, that's such a master class. I mean, in expression, and but also how the vibrato shapes through the line. Just listening for that, and so I think that's why, you know, going to the vocalist well for this, I think is one of the most valuable things that we can do. And so, like I was saying, you know, taking passages and shaping vibrato through them. Just not that you will do that in performance, but working on that to unbind the vibrato within each note, but to shape overall, I think is one of the most important things you can do. Of course, you know, you want to work on, you know, if we're developing it, we need to, you know, start at the basics and work on finding those thresholds, like doing wide dips to find kind of where we want to center it. and working on it with metronome. But I think also we need to work on varying not just the speed, but the depth, exploring, you know, how to shape the vibrato within a note. And so my final point with this actually, and if you have questions for me, go ahead and feel free to type them in the chat, because I'll be happy to take some at the end of this. But my final point behind this is really how to synthesize all of these things, how to take all of these, you know, considerations for just the sustain itself, the articulation, and vibrato, and how to combine them. And one of the things that I think is most important, and again, like I said, I'm going to send you this document afterwards, is to assign yourself a musical context for which to work on your fundamentals. So, you know, playing long tones at dolce espressivo or declamé, or and finding out how to use your everything that you're working on that way in order to, you know, to facilitate that tone concept, and actually blending it. You know, it's hard to tell where this and expression begin and end, right? Because they become one and the same. And so working on all of these things together, like I said, long tones with creating musical context for yourself, focusing on the front of the note. What kind of articulation are you going to use? What kind of, you know, are you going to tongue at all, or will it be an air start? Or what kind of speed of vibrato will you use? Like, where do you want the note to go? Incorporating all of these things together to finally, you know, come together, you know, into these exercises, I think is really important. So I think with that, I will leave it to questions. So if you have any for me, please let me know. Oh, one already popped up. As a high school saxophonist, I appreciate you doing this. It really helps me to understand. Oh, that is not a question. All right. All right. Well, thank you, Raz. Would an opera-like vibrato be acceptable for modern-day saxophonists? What type of instrument vibratos would be acceptable, like imitating a violin, trumpet, flute? That's a great question. You know, I think it really is contextually based. So much of what we, you know, we need to do is based, should be informed by what piece we're playing. Opera-like vibrato, I mean, if we were to truly imitate that, or truly imitate even a string vibrato, you'll notice that string vibratos really are quite fast. And for lack of a better way of describing this, I think saxophone, by comparison to other instruments, there are different densities of sound, and that we can't have the same kind of disturbance in a really like very dense kind of centered sound like the saxophone would normally have. I think a really fast and kind of wide vibrato has a place, but I think only in very specific circumstances for that, for saxophone. How has your concept of sound changed over the years? Has it changed? I think my sound concept will continue to change until I stop playing saxophone. I think that's one of the things that is most exciting about it, is that you're continually given an opportunity to hone your, I mean, the sound concept is one of the most personal things in our playing. And you continually get a chance to explore this and find different ways of expressing yourself. So I would also say that one of the things that you also need to do, and Professor Richtmeyer talked about this yesterday as well. I think that, and this goes a little bit beyond sound concept, but just in terms of expression, when you're practicing, you really need to think of yourself like almost like an actor. You can recite lines, you can play notes different ways, and explore inflection, explore different ways of shaping a note that works within that context. It doesn't have to, you don't have to come to a decision and lock on that. It can change, and it should change depending on what mood you're in that day. So, all right, let me see a few others. From Steve, can you talk about voicing in relation to tuning notes within a phrase and how that may affect the vibrato? Yeah. So, you know, when we're playing, you know, and we've been studying our instrument for a long time, we're aware of our tuning tendencies. And so I think that, you know, just everybody knows that the tendency of, you know, between long tube fingerings and short tube fingerings can tend to be short tube fingerings tend low and long tube fingerings tend high. Until, of course, you get into the upper range, and then short tube fingerings are sharp. But short tube fingerings in the mid range tend to be, if they're going to be one way, tend to be low. And so I think that vibrato, because I try and keep as consistent of a sound as possible between the ranges, you know, and tuning within a phrase. I guess for me, I will first play it and work on shaping it without vibrato, because I don't want to have to rely on vibrato just for only for expression. Of course, air shape and what we're doing with that matters a lot. And so I will address some of those first of all with just the air, and then add the vibrato into it. I would say also that I tend to think of vibrato depending on the range that we're in. Obviously, you have to control how wide the vibrato is, depending on range and dynamics in particular. And so, if you're going up into the upper range, you know, we need to have different considerations for vibrato than we would in the mids. So, do I consider different sound concepts between SATB saxophones, or one personal sound that transfers between each instrument? Yeah, Ellie, that's a great question. I think that each instrument has so much its own character that I try to find my sound within that natural character. I mean, the soprano for me, I guess also I would say it this way. I think soprano lends itself to oboe and flute really well. And so trying to find and explore different characters within that. So I have ideas for each, and there's some continuity, but I also try and explore the different timbral variances between the four. Thomas, how would you approach Amish oral cavity voicing for beginner students with an underbite? Yeah, so an underbite, an overbite is when your bottom teeth are behind your top teeth, and an underbite is when your top teeth are in front of your bottom teeth, just natural as a bite. The principles are the same. You may find that depending on how severe the underbite or overbite is, your placement on the mouthpiece may change. Ideally, we've got the bottom lip at the fulcrum, you know, or right around the fulcrum of the fulcrum point where the reed and mouthpiece tip opening meet. That's kind of the point of greatest control, but also flexibility. And this is a good exercise to do. You can just kind of walk it forward or walk it back. You'll notice that if you take in too much mouthpiece, the sound can become very brittle and you don't have a lot of control over it. If you take in too little, you know, you don't have much dynamic range. And so, and the sound is thinner. So I think if you can find the spot where the bottom lip meets at the fulcrum, and where that aligns with their natural bite, that's going to be the best for them. And then the principles are the same. Recommendations for alto or tenor mouthpieces, Riley, I'll write you about that. Josh asked about the Donaldson to front F exercise. That's in his book, Voicing. And the idea is that you would play a front F. So the X key and 2 with the octave key down, and you're playing that's the F above the staff. And the front F trick is if you can bend the pitch down, I don't remember what it is, a sixth, I think. Someone can correct me if it's different than that, but at least you have a large amount of flexibility from that. And if you have that flexibility, then you've unlocked a lot of your control in the oral cavity. When practicing long tones, especially in the upper register with some vibrato, I feel I have a decent grasp of the middle and lower register of vibrato, but the high register seems shrill or brash. I think that, you know, if you are able to play in the mid range with a good vibrato and like the sound, the upper range can become shrill or brash if you're in particular playing at the top of the mouthpiece pitch. You're probably playing too much into the top of the sound, and so I would encourage you to center your vibrato a little bit lower in the sound. From John, when do you make the decision to change the amount of lower lip to either cover the sound or open it up? Can you go into how the placement of the lip can affect the color and blend of notes, especially in context of changing registers? Yeah, so I was talking about that a little bit, you know, just before with, you know, about placement, but I don't vary my lip a lot. You know, the only time I really do that is if I'm in the lower range and I'm playing subtone. And sometimes if I will take my jaw out of the sound in order to play super soft, super low, that affects the amount of lip that I use, but otherwise I don't really change that. Stephen Banks asked me, do you have any thoughts on using spectral analysis in relation to developing sound? Yeah, well, that's one of the things that is so amazing now, and one of the things that makes me start to feel a little bit old is that all of these apps now, Tunable has it, I think Tonal Energy has it too, where they have these spectral analysis components to them where you can play and vary your tongue position and voicing, and you can actually watch the different parts of the harmonic series spike or go down, and you can really tie that to some of what we're talking about in terms of hearing things as, you know, whatever ideal you want in your sound, like, you know, pure or lower center or dark or bright or whatever, you know, that the presence of overtones in that has a lot to do with it. Let's see. Different styles of vibrato out there from different teachers. What do you prefer doing when performing a piece? I've had teachers telling me to do a wide type of vibrato and others telling me to do a little faster and not wide vibrato. I'm a bit confused on which to use. I hope. Yeah. So I think that you have to make personal decisions, kind of going back to what I was talking about, based upon being a student of music. Finding the vibrato that you identify with, so long as it isn't corrupting the sound or affecting pitch too much. We want to be able to have the sound. That's why I was saying there's a lot of room in your sound for the vibrato to exist, you know, between that upper and lower threshold. And so long as you're not hitting either one of those, and you're not letting it affect the center of pitch, meaning you're not letting the vibrato, the sound creep sharp or drop flat, I think it's a very personal decision, but one that also has to be, like I said, based on being a student of music and also understanding what piece you're playing and what fits within that context. Samuel asked me, yeah, Teal's a strong advocate for use of singing as means of developing tone. Yeah, I think, you know, I myself sing in lessons all the time, and I know it sounds terrible for the most part, but just in terms of, you know, trying to work on phrase shape and getting people to open up and play out. Steve Jordheim has a really interesting website called The Saxophonist Anatomy that they took fluoroscopic images of what's going on in the oral cavity, both when you're singing and when you're playing, and showing the similarities and differences between those. So you should really check that out if you can. Some very interesting videos. All right, one more. Sheldon, in your experience, have you found that different languages and the way they are produced vocally tend to affect people's conception of the ideal sound? Yeah, there have been studies done on that for sure. I suspect that that could be true. I don't have. I mean, there are schools of playing that you hear, you know, and so what I guess what's interesting to me is like how much of it is based upon, you know, what somebody else is doing, like a prominent saxophonist, you know, Claude DeLong or Nobuo Sagawa or you know, Arnold Bornkamp, or you know, any of the, you know, prominent saxophonists in the U.S. You know, how much of that is modeling, you know, students modeling that sound, and how much of that is language specific. But I know there have been studies done about that that are exploring that very thing. So it's an interesting subject for sure. So, well, anyway, everybody, thank you. Thank you for all of your interest in just this page in general, and thank you for tuning in today. Hope you have a great one. Bye-bye.